Ladies and gentlemen, the subcommittee will come to order. I'm Joe Wilson, Chairman of the Subcommittee of the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm very grateful today to welcome you to this hearing on the serious issues of the terrorism being financed by U.S. taxpayers, which should not occur. The explanation and the reason why we need to enforce the Taylor Force Act and to stop any pay-for-play. Last month, I was grateful to travel with the ranking member, Dean Phillips, to Israel. While we were there, we met with senior Israeli officials who are trying to keep their country and their citizens safe amid a dangerous wave of terrorism that has lasted for over a year and killed dozens of people being instigated by the regime in Tehran. The violent acts coming from the West Bank are a threat to Israel and a threat to America because of our close relationship with our friend and ally Israel. In 2016, an American citizen, Taylor Force, from my birthplace of Charleston, South Carolina, was cruelly and senselessly murdered by stabbing while as a graduate student on a trip to Tel Aviv. He was simply a person who was attacked by a cowardly individual with no provocation. Taylor was a former U.S. Army officer who graduated from West Point and was studying for his MBA. His wonderful and dedicated parents live in Kiowa Island, South Carolina. His death was a deranged and inhuman action. Please let us now bow our heads for a moment of silence in honor of Taylor and all other victims of terrorism who should be alive and with their families today. Thank you, and God bless the memory of Taylor Force. After Taylor's death, Americans were shocked to learn that the Palestinian Authority maintains a system for paying salaries and pensions to imprisoned terrorists or the families of the deceased terrorist. These outrageous systems of awards and incentivizing of terrorist mass murder is why we're here today. And that's why 5 years ago, Congress passed the Taylor Force Act, which said that no U.S. economic aid could directly benefit the Palestinian Authority unless the Palestinian Authority fully dismantled this grotesque pay-for-slay system. This made sure that no taxpayers were directly or indirectly enabling these payments for terrorism, but it also created an incentive for the Palestinian people to reject the PA's barbaric set of rewarding indiscriminate murder. Unfortunately, 5 years later, terrorists are still getting their blood money, and then Israelis are living through another wave of violent attacks. Right now, the Palestinian Authority is trying to assert demands and conditions on the normalization of talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But the Palestinian Authority is paying people to commit acts of mass murder. The United States government cannot take any of their asks seriously until they stop this conduct. I hope the witnesses today will tell us about more of what the United States can do to try to get this shameful pay-for-slay system dismantled. I also hope that our witnesses will speak to the role of the regime in Tehran in supporting the most recent spike of terrorist attacks and what that means for Israelis and Palestinians moving forward. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I'm very grateful now to recognize our ranking member, Dean Phillips of Minnesota, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Wilson, for holding this hearing, and to our esteemed witnesses for joining us today. I look forward to a robust discussion on ending pay-for-slay and discussing the importance of ensuring security and stability in both Israel and the West Bank. This topic is clearly an important and timely one, as tension and violence in the West Bank is at an all-time high, with more Israelis having been killed in terror attacks through August of this year than in all of 2022 combined, along with a corresponding increase in violence against Palestinian civilians and their property. Further, President Abbas's recent comments that yet again distort the Holocaust and promote anti-Semitic stereotypes only seeks to incite hatred and make peace even more difficult to achieve for all. And let me be clear, I condemn terrorism, I condemn glorification of terrorism, and anti-Semitism in all of its forms. The Taylor-Force Act, which Congress passed into law in 2018, rightly prevents economic support funds from going directly to benefit the Palestinian Authority until they end their grotesque policy of compensating individuals who commit acts of terrorism and the families of deceased terrorists. This policy not only rewards acts of terrorism, but also moves us further away from a negotiated two-state solution that aims to see Israelis and Palestinians living with equal measures of freedom, security, and prosperity. The Palestinian Authority must continue to work with the United States to end this harmful practice and create a system that supports all Palestinian people in need without incentivizing violence. With violence at an all-time high, it is important to understand the numerous challenges contributing to the deteriorating security situation in the West Bank. Armed groups, particularly in Jenin and Nablus, have flourished as a younger generation of militants have become increasingly active. Israeli military incursions, a lack of political process, declining legitimacy within the PA, severe economic stagnation, and the proliferation of weapons have all led to growing discontent. While many of these frustrations are indeed homegrown, it no doubt creates an opportunity for malign actors like Iran and Hamas to exploit, as hastening the downfall of the PA only creates a governance void in the West Bank and further jeopardizes Israeli security. The Palestinian Authority is already on a downward spiral, as we all know. While the PA was created as an interim step in a diplomatic process that would culminate in statehood, it is sadly apparent that we are no closer to a Palestinian state than we were when the PA was established after the Oslo Accords. Furthermore, the PA today has severe economic and governance challenges. A recent press release from an IMF staff visit noted that, quote, persistently high unemployment and poverty add to macroeconomic fragilities, end quote. And according to the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, around 80% of Palestinians consider the PA to be corrupt, 80%. As these issues deepen, the PA leadership has responded by becoming even more autocratic. President Abbas, who is almost 88 years old and is on year 18 of his 4-year term, has repeatedly chosen to arrest critics, close political space, and prevent serious discussions of what or who comes after his passing. So how does the United States support the Palestinian people while also ensuring that United States dollars do not support a corrupt, mismanaged government that incentivizes terror? The United States, in accordance with all U.S. laws, including the Taylor-Force Act, supports a variety of programs that help address the root causes of violence and instability, including public health, social services, education, private sector productivity, and workforce development. The Middle East Partnership for Peace Act invests in Israeli and Palestinian peace building and cooperation, while the United States Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority facilitates communication between Israeli and Palestinian security units and works to ensure the PA security forces become the effective and well-trained force necessary to assert more control in the West Bank. All of these efforts are in place to foster opportunity, understanding, and stability, which will ultimately benefit both Palestinians and Israelis. So let me close by speaking briefly about regional normalization. The Abraham Accords, the Negev Forum, the East Med Gas Forum are all examples of great opportunities to bring the region together around shared interests and a desire to make the Middle East a more secure, stable, and prosperous region. These efforts must prioritize having Palestinian voices at the table. As the U.S. continues to negotiate with Saudi Arabia on a path to normalize relations with Israel, we must capitalize on this opportunity to demand the PA take accountability for its governance, economic, and security crisis, and to push both sides to take meaningful and permanent steps towards a negotiated two-state solution. It will take the hard work of Israelis, Palestinians, regional and international partners to step up to the plate and take risks in the name of peace. But it is something that I would argue we should all strive for. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back. Actually, I have no time left, so I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Dean Phillips, and you were perfectly on time. And also, I hope you see, too, there's really bipartisanship as we approach this issue today, and Republicans and Democrats united that there should be every effort to block any U.S. taxpayers going to promoting pay for slay. We're pleased to have our distinguished witnesses with us today. The Honorable Elliot Abrams, former Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. We also have Jonathan Shanzer from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And finally, we have Dr. Michael Koplow from the Israel Policy Forum. Thank you all three for being here. And we want to thank you for being here. Your statements will be made part of the record. And if each of you could have your spoken remarks to 5 minutes so that we may have time for questions from our members, and they too will be held to 5 minutes. I now recognize Mr. Abrams for the opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me here today. Let me start by saying that something you mentioned, that there's a serious rise in terrorism and terrorist attacks in the West Bank this year. Why has that happened? I would give you 3 reasons. First, Iran. I think Iran is making a serious effort to get more money and more weapons into the West Bank. Obviously, much of it is blocked by Israel or Jordan, but some of it gets through across the Syrian and Jordanian borders. Secondly, Hamas is trying very hard to increase the amount of terrorism in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. It wants to restrain attacks from Gaza because it wants to avoid Israeli strikes on Gaza, where it is governing. It wants a level of calm there. It wants the border crossings open. It wants the violence to be in the West Bank, and it is succeeding in doing that. So far this year, 35 Israelis, I believe that's the correct number, have been murdered by terrorists, more than in all of 2022. And thirdly, underlying the increase in terrorism is the Palestinian Authority's continuing refusal to fight terrorism unless it comes from their rival for power, Hamas. Of course, when they're doing that, they're not really fighting terrorism. It's a kind of power struggle between the PA, PLO, Fatah, and their rival in Hamas. As long as the pay-for-slay system continues, the message to Palestinians is terrorists should be honored and rewarded. There are clear alternatives to pay-for-slay. It would be reasonable, I think, for the PA to say, for example, that whatever the crime is committed, the criminal's family, children should not suffer. They could have implemented a welfare-based system, a system of family allowances based on the number of children. One example. And they have steadfastly refused to do that, precisely because such a system would no longer honor and reward terrorists based on the seriousness of their crimes. The Act, the Taylor Force Act, continues to constitute effective pressure against that unacceptable system. It has not meant, as you said, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Phillips, it has not meant abandoning the Palestinian people. As you know, it only affects ESF funds that go directly to the PA. This year, the Biden administration resumed funding for UNRWA. And this year, the United States will again be its largest donor at over $200 million. I want to make 2 points quickly about the Taylor Force specifically. First, the Act urges that at the UN and in all bilateral and multilateral engagements with all governments and organizations committed to the cause of peace, U.S. diplomats are supposed to highlight the issue of Palestinian payments for acts of terrorism and urge other governments and organizations to stop payments to the PA until they stop the pay-for-slay. I don't think that's being done. And I would urge the subcommittee and committee at some point to ask Secretary Blinken and Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, why not? Secondly, the Act calls on all donor countries providing budgetary support for the PA to stop it, to cease budgetary support until they stop incentivizing terror. I don't actually think that's the position of the administration. I believe it has been encouraging other nations, and I'd give you the example of Saudi Arabia, to give cash to the PA. And that undermines the Taylor Force Act. There are many ways to support the Palestinian people. but giving cash to the inefficient and corrupt PA is one of the worst of them. It fuels corruption and allows the PA to continue the pay-for-slay system. We should be urging support for the Palestinian people, but not for the PA. Thank you for convening this hearing and for your continuing monitoring of the Taylor Force Act and U.S. assistance to Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Abrams. We appreciate your distinguished service for our country.
Thank you.
We now recognize Dr. Shanzer for his opening statement.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Phillips, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. If you don't know the name Hakeem Awad, you probably should. We all should. In 2011, he murdered all 5 members of the Fogel family, including a 3-month-old baby girl. Awad has since received tens of thousands of dollars from the Martyrs Fund of the Palestinian Authority while he sits in an Israeli jail. Awad is one of many convicted terrorists who benefit from the program commonly known as pay-for-slay. Bottom line, the PA, once seen as a peace partner, deliberately rewards terrorists for murdering Israeli civilians. And adding to the outrage, some of the victims have been American citizens too. When Congress passed the Taylor Force Act 5 years ago, it curbed the expansion of this twisted system. The Israelis also helped by withholding some of the funds earmarked for the PA, but more can be done. But in the meantime, the West Bank is boiling over. The Islamic Republic of Iran is flooding the West Bank with weapons and cash for terrorist groups that are eroding the PA's grip on power. In just over a year, more than 2,100 attacks have been funded, orchestrated, or inspired by Iran in the West Bank. My organization, FDD, has tracked all of that on our website. Groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Lion's Den have established no-go zones in large towns like Jenin in the West Bank. The PA's security forces should have stepped in, but unfortunately, they've been a complete non-factor. And this has only emboldened Iran and its proxies. The so-called Axis has now set up a nerve center, as they call it, in Lebanon to coordinate military operations in the West Bank. Hamas, in short, is loving this strategy rather than periodically inviting destructive wars upon Gaza, where Hamas is the governor. The group is now exporting chaos to the territory that it seeks to conquer. The West Bank is Hamas's ultimate prize in the political and military contest that it has had since 2006 with the Palestinian Authority. If we're not careful, Mahmoud Abbas could gift Hamas and Iran this valuable piece of real estate. At 87 years old, after more than 18 years in power, Abbas is past his expiration date. Worse, he has turned the PA into a cesspool of corruption where political expression is outlawed and the government enriches Abbas's cronies, not to mention murderers. In other words, pay-for-slay is just one of many serious challenges facing the PA right now, which is why today's hearing is so important. Let me recommend a couple of steps here that could help right the ship. First, let's continue the rigorous application of Taylor Force. Make it clear no more U.S. assistance so long as pay-for-slay continues. We could even tweak the language to prevent the PA from even indirectly benefiting from U.S. aid. 2, encourage the Palestinians to establish a social security program to negate the need for the Martyrs Fund. It would provide a financial safety net for all Palestinians in need. The Israelis actually support this. The White House might even ask the Saudis to finance this fund, regardless of whether normalization talks succeed. 3, Palestinian Social Security can help end American support to the UN Relief and Works Agency. UNRWA must be cut. The agency perpetuates the fiction of a Palestinian refugee problem that ended decades ago. 4th, let's push Mahmoud Abbas on succession. The more he refuses to clarify the PA's succession process, the more likely we will see a full-blown crisis in the West Bank after Abbas leaves the scene. 5, increase support for the U.S. Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinians. This will strengthen the PA security forces, and it will also improve coordination with the IDF. Similarly, we should strengthen the military cooperation between Jordan and Israel, particularly along that porous border, that long border between the two countries where Iran and Hezbollah have been smuggling the bulk of the weapons getting into the West Bank. Next, we should enforce the rewards for justice bounty on Hamas West Bank leader Saleh Arouri. He roams free in countries like Turkey and Qatar and Lebanon. We should be forcing these countries to take action. Eighth, we should pass the Hamas International Financing Prevention Act. This would mandate sanctions on senior Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists, as well as individuals, companies, and foreign state actors supporting them. And finally, we must halt all sanctions relief and ransom payments to the Islamic Republic of Iran. The regime directly finances West Bank terror. If Washington wants to sustain the PA and protect Israel, our Iran policy must change. Let me stop here. On behalf of FDD, thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shanzer, and we now recognize Dr. Koplow for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you to discuss the important issue of terrorism against Israelis and the situation in Israel and the West Bank. This issue has taken on greater salience this year, as more Israelis have been killed in terror attacks through the end of August than Israeli terrorism fatalities in all of 2022. Combating Palestinian terrorism directed at Israeli citizens and increasing stability and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike are clear interests and priorities of the United States. It is critical to continue holding the Palestinian Authority to account for its payments to prisoners and families of those killed in the course of committing terrorism, as these payments incentivize violence against innocent Israelis and run counter to any peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In addition to enforcing the Taylor Force Act and fully implementing its provisions until its conditions are satisfied, it is also important to promote additional measures and policies that will counter the trend of increasing violence. This requires unwavering support for Israeli security and support for measures that will stabilize the West Bank and build toward a negotiated and viable political outcome that improves the lives of Israelis and Palestinians. The Taylor Force Act is an important policy tool that seeks to shift PA behavior away from tying and escalating payments directly to violent acts. This payment system is an insidious initiative that encourages the murder of innocent Israelis, and it must be stopped. The Taylor Force Act must remain in place until the PA meets its requirements, and the burden must be on Palestinian leadership to demonstrate compliance, one of which may be moving to a needs-based system. The Taylor Force Act contains a number of exceptions to its prohibition of economic support funds. This approach smartly recognizes the balance required between holding the PA to account for its misdeeds and ensuring that areas under the PA's control do not devolve into anarchy, while continuing to work toward peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Support for the Palestinian people, rather than support for the PA, demonstrates the American commitment to improving lives and providing an alternative approach to violence. ESF that is not controlled or implemented by and does not directly benefit the PA demonstrates to Palestinians the United States' commitment to their well-being and to a future society that can live in peace alongside Israel. Similarly, the Nita M. Lowey Middle East Partnership for Peace Act funding promotes active engagement and dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians in support of a future two-state outcome. People-to-people activities that receive funding through MEPA provide pathways to peace while making terrorism less desirable. Perhaps most saliently, it remains vital to support the efforts of the United States Security Coordinator in ensuring that security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority continues, and that the Palestinian Authority security forces are properly trained and prepared for counterterrorism and law enforcement activities. The drop in organized terrorism against Israelis since the first decade of the 21st century is attributable in large measure to the success of the USSC mission. An effective and well-trained PASIF provides both severe risk mitigation for Israel's defense architecture and a key building block for future Palestinian statehood. The USSC's support for security coordination between Israel and the PA also ensures that Israeli security needs are met. Concerns about the PASIF's performance and willingness to confront terrorist elements in Palestinian cities are absolutely warranted. But the PASIF remains an important security partner for Israel, as Israeli political and security officials routinely attest. There are measures that the United States should take in partnership with Israel as well, in order to choke off incentives for Palestinian terrorism. The United States should encourage Israel to limit growth in Israeli settlements to areas that would not challenge the contiguity of a future Palestinian state, and to dismantle settlement outposts that are illegal under Israeli law. There is no excuse for terror. There are no actions that justify its use. Yet all those who live in the region have a responsibility to avoid inflammatory behavior that can lead to escalating tension on the ground. The United States should also embrace the opportunity created by the Abraham Accords to use the expansion of regional normalization to incentivize the PA to institute necessary reforms. The United States and Israel can both encourage states that have normalized relations with Israel and potential future normalizers to engage with the PA on reforming its institutions and policies, including, and foremost, payments to prisoners and families of terrorists, in return for the resumption of economic assistance. Furthermore, including Palestinians in the normalization process will help inoculate these historic agreements from the instability that is endemic to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and can also incentivize Palestinians to embrace a diplomatic process rather than turn to terrorism. As the PA loses more credibility, legitimacy, and popularity, the leadership and institutional vacuum is contributing to more terrorism, more violence, and more instability. The U.S. must continue to use the Taylor Force Act, along with the other tools available to it, in order to support the Palestinian institutions and the Palestinian people working toward positive change. All incentives for Palestinians to turn to terrorism must be combated, which means holding the PA to account while improving stability and security in the West Bank and the quality of life for Palestinians. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koplow. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And hey, I know that Dr. Jackson and myself were so pleased. We've never had 3 witnesses right on point in 5 minutes. This is a first, so thank you very much. And we appreciate that. And then, Secretary Abrams, I want to thank you for beginning with truly identifying that it's the regime in Tehran as the source of the terrorist mass murders in every way sponsoring terrorism around the world. I deeply regret that the Biden administration has agreed to pay $6 billion in ransom to the regime in Tehran. To me, this is just so bizarre, as we are still in the global war on terrorism, and additionally, we now have a war instigated by war criminal Putin, where clearly with the Chinese Communist Party, the regime in Tehran, we have a conflict between dictators who seek to rule by gun, opposing democracies with rule by law. And so at this time, what a dangerous time for the people of Israel and for the United States, for the American families too. Dr. Shanzer, what is the role in the region that the regime in Tehran is playing in driving the current surge of terrorists emanating from the West Bank? And what funding is Iran providing and other kinds of support and weapons?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. The hand of Iran can be seen throughout all of the various terrorist groups that are active on Israel's borders: Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Shiite militias in Syria. We've seen Iran's hand in all of them. Now we see cash, we see training, we see arms, the smuggling, all of it has been orchestrated by Iran, and really actually one of the eye-opening things that came to light from the 2021 conflict, that 11-day war between Israel and Hamas, the Israelis learned of the existence of this nerve center. This is a coordinating operation out of Lebanon. We're not sure whether this is a virtual center or whether there is actual physical location, but their goal is to coordinate the activities, the violent activities that we see primarily in the West Bank, with the idea of destabilizing this territory and ultimately bringing down the Palestinian Authority, thereby completing the sort of stranglehold, if you will, of Iran-backed terrorist groups surrounding Israel. It's an encirclement strategy that I think is probably a prelude to the final sort of countdown, if you will, in the nuclear standoff between Iran and Israel. So this is, I think, a very dangerous development, and one that I think we should be doing everything that we can to stop, specifically by not giving the regime in Iran more money to finance these activities.
And God, it's shocking to think of, as you say, operating out of Lebanon, Hezbollah, just the interconnection with Hamas in Gaza. We've just got to be understanding how dangerous all this is. And Dr. Koplow, the Biden administration has made a policy decision to restart substantial U.S. assistance to the Palestinian Authority. In your experience, has there been any assistance program to the West Bank and Gaza that served American national interest? And if the administration is going to spend the money, how should they spend it to further U.S. policy goals and provide for security?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The assistance that the Biden administration is providing to the West Bank and Gaza, to the best of my knowledge and according to State Department certification, is not violating the Taylor Force Act. Thankfully, the United States is not providing any funds that go directly to the Palestinian Authority or that directly benefit the Palestinian Authority. I do believe that the economic support funds that the United States provides are beneficial to Palestinians, to Israeli security, and to U.S. interests. And furthermore, I believe that the funding that the United States provides to the U.S. Security Coordinator that goes to ensure coordination between Israel and the Palestinians, and that goes to train and equip the Palestinian Authority security forces with non-lethal weapons is also extremely important, both for Israeli security and for U.S. interests. In all of these cases, this funding contributes to a better environment on the ground, helps build the Palestinian economy, ensures that there are Palestinians who would otherwise be either out of work, who may turn to terrorism, as we've seen in places like Jenin and Nablus, where you have extremely high Palestinian unemployment, are instead engaged in more productive activities. And so long as this money does not benefit the Palestinian Authority directly in any way, I believe that it continues to be a U.S. interest to provide these funds.
And Secretary Abrams, what more can we do with the Taylor Force Act to protect the people of Israel?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. As I said in the testimony, I don't think we're talking to other governments and organizations about it enough. I think we're asking them to be helpful to the Palestinians without saying, but not this way, because of the pay-to-slay system. Pardon me. And there is a risk that as other governments, Saudis may be the first, start helping the PA, they undermine the effectiveness of Taylor Force by providing cash.
Thank you again for your insight, and each of you for your service. I now recognize Ranking Member Dean Phillips for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield my time to Mr. Schneider as much as he might consume.
Thank you, and I'm going to be quick. First, I want to thank witnesses for being here and sharing your insights. And let's talk quickly why we are here. We are here, as was noted, because the PA continues to, as Mr. Abrams, you said, honor and reward terrorists. And they call it a martyrs fund. We rightly call it pay for slay. And it is something that the U.S. must not and will not ever accept, which is why we have the Taylor Force Act. And Dr. Shanzer, you said it well. We have to enforce it. We have to strengthen our enforcement of it and make sure the Palestinians understand that as long as they do that, there will be increasingly serious consequences for them. But Dr. Koplow, you also touched on, and something I'm proud of as the chair of the Abraham Accords Caucus, that the Abraham Accords Caucus provides an opportunity for us not to just further possibilities within the region for peace and prosperity for all the people of the region, but also work with allies and other signatories of the Abraham Accords Caucus to join and put pressure on the Palestinians to end this horrible policy. And again, going back to Mr. Abrams, it is the policy, the more we talk about it with these allies, the more impact we will have. So I'm glad we were here. I will close with this, just quoting what Dr. Koplow said in his remarks. We have unwavering support for Israeli security and support for measures that will stabilize the West Bank and build toward a negotiated and viable political outcome that improves the lives of Israelis and Palestinians. That's why we're here, and that's why we'll continue to enforce the act. And I'm sorry I went long. I yield my time back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider, and I'll continue with my questions. Just a quick yes or no from each of you, if you might. Is the United States in compliance with the Taylor Force Act? Starting with you, Mr. Abrams.
Not fully. Not fully.
Not fully. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think our money is not going to the PA, ESF money.
So it's fungible.
Yeah, and I think we're not putting the kind of pressure that we could on others.
Okay, thank you. Dr.
I believe we are in compliance, but I do think that there are other things that we can do to tighten that the legislation itself. The indirect support might be cut as well.
Okay, appreciate it. Dr. Koplow?
Yes, I believe we are in compliance.
Okay, thank you all. I think it's fair to say that we're looking at lesser of two evils here as it relates to Hamas and PA. You know, we have not been terribly successful in the United States with regime change and replacement, I think it's fair to say. So I'd like some perspective on the alternatives. If the PA were to collapse, what happens in that vacuum? I have my suspicions. Clearly, I don't think it's in the best interest of anybody for a full occupation by the Israelis. So starting with you, again, Mr. Abrams, I'd welcome perspective on what what would happen, but B, what is the responsibility of other neighbors, the Jordanians, the Saudis, not just the United States and Israel, as it relates to that question?
You know, the Israeli view, Mr. Phillips, is that the collapse of the PA would be dangerous.
Yeah.
And they certainly don't want, they haven't wanted since Oslo, to take full administrative responsibility for the West Bank and Gaza. I think you're right in suggesting that what we should be doing is talking to other donors and potential donors, and particularly Jordan, because they're right there.
Yeah.
Because we're coming to the turning point. Abbas is 87 or 88. He won't go on forever. What does the PA look like after that? Who's in control? Is that a calamity, or is it a moment of opportunity to change the PA?
Doctor?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Let me just say this. I believe that we are on the precipice of a full collapse in not a lot of time. And the way to head this off is to force Abbas to clarify the succession process, or potentially even have him stand aside. We have been in a situation where we've been tracking this succession crisis now for years. The State Department has refused to engage directly with the Palestinian Authority for fear of upsetting Mahmoud Abbas, for fear of, I don't know, destabilizing him in some way. The bottom line is, the longer we wait and the more chaotic the West Bank becomes, the less likely that the other candidates are going to be willing to step in. Nobody wants to be the captain of the Titanic, right? This is the mentality that I've heard to describe these other candidates for succession so long as this crisis endures.
Thank you. If I could just have a minute for Dr. Koplow.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. As Mr. Abrams, I think, rightly notes, Israel has a strong interest in keeping the Palestinian Authority in place. That has been the policy of successive Israeli governments, including the current Israeli government. If the PA collapses, the two most likeliest scenarios, in my estimation, are a full Hamas takeover of the West Bank, and they have been working assiduously over the past couple of years to increase their presence in the West Bank. And second, Israel goes in and reestablishes its presence in large Palestinian cities, as was the case before the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, and as was the case during the Second Intifada, which is an outcome that I know the Israelis would like to avoid at nearly any cost.
Okay. Thank you all. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Phillips. We now proceed to Congressman Brian Mast of Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. As U.S. representatives, it is, of course, important that we ask, is the U.S. in compliance with something? But I think it misses a more important question, which maybe I'll see if we have time to answer at the end, which is just simply, why is the PA paying people who kill Israelis? It's maybe a little bit more of a philosophical question, but probably a more important one to answer to get to the crux of the issue, in my opinion. I want to use this backdrop of agreement to push something that I personally believe and then ask for analysis on it. I think the two-state solution is dead, and I think it should be dead. I've never agreed with it personally as an individual. It never made sense to me that you take an entity and make a state out of it that from its very inception would likely be a terrorist government organization. And I think you all have quantified that in part. Pay to slay does exist. You know, you've all said in various ways they want, Mr. Abrams, they want violence here but not there. They're very tactical and specific about where they want it, using the terms West Bank terror, you know, incentive for violence, and the list goes on. This is not hyperbole. Everybody agrees on this. Personally, I think we should be working to optimize the status quo. And I use myself as an example to say sometimes, you know, look, I'm missing 2 legs. Things are never going to be perfect for me, but I work to optimize the status quo that exists for me. I think we should be working to optimize the status quo that exists there, because sometimes things just aren't going to get better in a certain place. I'm not going to regrow legs. I don't think the 2-state solution is going to regrow there. So I want to start with this question with the time that I have. And it was starting to be touched on in the last one. And it's just simply this. Would Hamas, let's just start with this, would Hamas win an election in Gaza? And then I'll ask, would Hamas win an election in the West Bank? And then I'll ask, would Hamas win an election combined?
There are polls, Mr. Mast.
And I'm familiar with them.
So, you know, many of them show that Hamas would win in the West Bank, but Fatah would win in Gaza. The devil you know is not liked because people live under repression, and so they react against the government that is repressing them. Today, I think Hamas probably would win because the PA is so unpopular.
I would tend to agree that I think Hamas has a leg up, if you will, on the Palestinian Authority. But I think it boils down to poor governance and corruption on the part of the PA. It is so thoroughly detested by its own people that Hamas has emerged as the anti-corruption candidate, and this is what lends it that credibility right now.
And I'll let you answer as well, sir, but let me add something that maybe after you answer, you all could go back and answer as well. Should we be negotiating separately? Should they be considered separate entities, Gaza and the West Bank?
Thank you, Congressman. Polls obviously are difficult within the West Bank and Gaza. I agree with Mr. Abrams that the likely scenario is that Fatah would win in Gaza given Hamas's unpopularity, that we should, of course, doubt the free and fair results of any election in Gaza held under Hamas auspices. I think in the West Bank, it's more complicated. Fatah, before the last elections that were scheduled and then canceled, had fractured into different lists. I think if there was one Fatah list that ran in a unified fashion, it would have a better chance of winning in the West Bank. But certainly, the Palestinian Authority and Fatah are deeply unpopular in the West Bank at the moment, given the various issues within the Palestinian Authority of corruption, transparency, and non-democracy.
Just to answer your question, Mr. Congressman, we already are treating the West Bank and Gaza as 2 separate entities. In fact, if we're to be honest right now, the chances of a 2-state solution are essentially nil because we have a 3-state solution. And I'm not even sure that there's that, right? I'm not sure that the West Bank is going to be willing to engage in any serious dialogue that would lead to an independent state. But in the meantime, you still have this additional entity in Gaza run by Hamas, and it cannot be treated as part of the West Bank Palestinian Authority.
Anybody care to touch on that first question from the very beginning?
2-state solution? Or
Why does
which-
pay to slay exist to begin with?
This goes back, I think, to Yasser Arafat and the founding of the PLO, which was a terrorist group from the beginning. And I think if you look at what Arafat was saying in Arabic, from the very moment that he returned, he was a supporter of terrorism.
Thank you very much. We now proceed to Congresswoman Kathy Manning of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a constituent in my district whose daughter, an American who was living in Israel, was killed by a Palestinian terrorist. Every month, this grief-stricken father calls me to ask why that terrorist's family continues to get money for the devastating crime he committed. And those calls are a searing reminder to me that the PA's appalling policy of rewarding the families of terrorists is reprehensible. It should be condemned by all, and it must be stopped. When deadly terrorist acts are rewarded with money, it encourages more terrorism and makes peace harder to achieve. The Taylor Force Act rightly ensures that our assistance does not directly benefit the PA until they end this brutal practice once and for all, or rather, it should ensure that. Each of you have weighed in on whether the U.S. is in compliance with Taylor Force, and there's some disagreement among the three of you. So I'd like to ask those of you who said that the U.S. is in compliance the follow-up question. If the U.S. is in compliance with the Taylor Force Act, and if it's actually doing what it was intended to do, Dr. Koplow, do you think it's in doing what it was intended to do?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The Palestinian Authority, of course, has not complied with the requirements in the Taylor Force Act. It is why the United States is still not providing any assistance that directly benefits the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority budget comes effectively from three sources. One of those three sources is foreign assistance. That source of support for the Palestinian Authority has been under severe threat since the Taylor Force Act was passed. It is not only the result of the Taylor Force Act directly, it's also a result of the fact that after Congress in its wisdom passed the Taylor Force Act, the Israeli Knesset passed companion legislation that is not identical but similar to Taylor Force. In addition, countries in the region have also ceased their support for the Palestinian Authority. I believe that no country in the region has given direct support to the Palestinian Authority. Some reports say 2019. I've heard from Israeli officials since 2017. But obviously, Taylor Force had an important demonstration effect as well on other countries. The Palestinian Authority is undergoing severe fiscal crisis as a result. I think that the pressure needs to be maintained on the Palestinian Authority, and I think that the more that that pressure is felt, the closer we will get to the Palestinian Authority ending this awful practice and hopefully instituting a different system that is not based on rewarding terror.
Dr. Shanzer, would you agree with that?
I would largely agree with it. I don't think I take any exception to any one sentence. I just do think that the issue right now is how do we up that pressure further? And I don't know if there is a way to do it with the current system that we have devised, primarily because the Palestinian Authority is more than willing to pay the pain forward to its own people. In other words, that budget that Dr. Koplow just mentioned that continues to constrict because of America cutting its assistance, the Palestinian Authority will just essentially deprive its own people. What I've suggested here, based on what conversations that I've had with Israelis and others who are very familiar with this dynamic, they suggest the implementation of a social security program that would begin to provide a safety net for all destitute Palestinians, people who are in need, and cut this other program entirely. You could have people who are in jail or the families of those who are in jail receiving the same amounts as any other family in the West Bank. That would, I think, be an equalizer, if you will, and that would be the way, at least one would hope, we could cut pay for slay entirely.
Thank you. Mr. Abrams, I want to turn to the malign influence of Iran, which we know is growing in the region. What can we be doing to cut off the flow of resources from Iran to terrorist groups like Hamas and PIJ in the West Bank and in Gaza?
I think it's very important that we work as closely as possible with Jordan. It used to be the case, not too many years ago, that you never heard about money or guns crossing over from Jordan, but you do now. I don't think it's probably a lack of effort on the Jordanian part, but it's happening. So I think we should be having conversations with them and the Israelis about how to do better at sealing that border.
What changed? Why were they effective previously, but there's more leakage of resources and weapons now through Jordan?
It may just be a much greater Iranian and Hezbollah effort, and maybe the Jordanians haven't sort of reacted by raising their effort.
Thank you. My time is about to expire. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Kathy Manning. And we now proceed to Congressman Dr. Ronnie Jackson of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. We here in Congress cannot afford to ignore the threat posed by Iran, Iranian military proxies, terrorist organizations in the Middle East, all against the interest of the United States and our allies. During my time in Congress, I've done everything I can to support Israel. I've signed letters to demand answers and to hold the Biden administration accountable. I've written legislation that has been signed into law. I've traveled to Israel as part of official delegations to show the world that the United States stands with our unique and important ally. Let's just be clear, Israel has the right to exist in security, free from violent assault, and the United States should do everything we can to uphold that right and to oppose all those who threaten it. While I found that there are some here in Washington who do not share my views, unfortunately, there are too many in public office who are choosing to side with the terrorists against Israel. And just in my personal opinion, some of those are members of our current administration in the actions that they take or they fail to take. The Biden administration knows that the Palestinian Authority pays terrorists to injure or kill innocent Americans and Israelis in Israel through its pay-to-slave program, and they know American taxpayer dollars are directly funding it. This is in direct violation of the Taylor Force Act. It personally makes me sick to think about it. So I thought I personally wanted to do something about this and take action more so than what's been done to date. Last December, in my personal capacity, not as a member of the Congress, but in my personal capacity, I was proud to join with Taylor Force's parents, Stuart and Robbie Force, to sue the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken for their blatant violations of the Taylor Force Act. The Taylor Force Act is named after Taylor Force, of course, a U.S. Army veteran, a West Point graduate, considered to be a native of Lubbock, Texas, in fact, which is where I was born and just minutes away from my hometown in Levelland. Sadly, he was murdered by Palestinian terrorists, and we all know the story here, while he was in Israel. His killers were then rewarded by the Palestinian Authority with a bounty payment as part of the pay-to-slave program. Taylor Force was a good American, and it breaks my heart to think that U.S. taxpayers' dollars in any way contributed to his death. We must honor his life and his legacy by ensuring implementation of the law and preventing these senseless and brutal murders from ever happening again. President Biden, in my opinion, has willingly ignored the law by resuming payments of U.S. taxpayer dollars to the Palestinian Authority, directly facilitating and promoting violent extremists against our greatest ally. Our lawsuit demands that the U.S. government abide by the Taylor Force Act and immediately end funding to the Palestinian Authority. According to an article from Forbes during the last year of the Obama administration, over 350 million U.S. Taxpayer dollars were sent to the Palestinian Authority. In 2018, President Trump cut that aid to zero in accordance with the Taylor Force Act. Just a few months after coming back into office, President Biden made the horrible decision to resume sending U.S. taxpayer dollars to the Palestinian Authority, which has been, in my opinion, directly used to fund this type of terrorism. It's common knowledge, and we mentioned this in passing, that once these taxpayer dollars are given to the PA, that those funds instantly become fungible. While the funds may be designated for humanitarian support, in reality, these funds, if nothing else, they free up other resources within the Palestinian Authority organization that can be put towards terrorist attacks and the pay-to-slave program. I guess one of my questions is do you have any recommendations on how, we talk about direct support, direct money, but I think we all we're not naive enough to know that a lot of the money that's indirectly going there is actually doing the same thing that we're trying to prevent here. What ways can we in Congress, what things can we put in place to assure that there's no indirect money that's going to support this as well? Because I think that serves the same purpose, and we're not accomplishing anything that we wanted to accomplish with the Taylor Force Act if we allow that to happen. Should it be tied to some type of incentive? As the terrorist attacks, rise, the money, dries up. I don't know. Do you have any suggestions? Mr. Abrams, I'll start with you.
Well, this kind of hearing, I think, is a great way to draw attention to this. And I think you should have another hearing like this with administration witnesses, asking them whether they are pushing as hard as they can on the PA, on other donors, and making sure that the money that's going in from state and from AID is not going to the PA indirectly, as you suggest.
I would just add this, that we currently have a position at the State Department's Coordinator for Palestinian Affairs. And in that office, we see the day-to-day advocating for additional funds to the Palestinians, in some ways looking for creative workarounds to the Taylor Force Act and its enforcement. That is the kind of thing that is incredibly counterproductive, and I think it should be policy that these things stop. We might even need to consider a cessation of that office so long as those practices continue. The idea here is there should be zero tolerance policy, and that should be across U.S. government. I don't think it's that way right now.
Thank you, Congressman. I believe that the United States must continue to very thoroughly vet every organization, as the State Department does, that receives any grant money through ESF or through MEPA, and it's important that that vetting continue and that Congress maintain its oversight over that vetting process.
Thank you. I think my time has expired, but I'd just like to say that I think that all of the money should dry up, even the money that's going indirectly. It should somehow be tied to the level of violence in the area. I think that if there's an incentive on that side, somehow I think that people would be incentivized to stop this pay-to-slay program. Thank you. I yield back.
And thank you very much, Dr. Jackson, and also thank you very much for your association with the Taylor Force family. That is so inspiring, and I'm grateful for your visits to Israel, too. Ranking Member Phillips and I, a month ago today, were in Jerusalem meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and so our associations are so important. Next, we have Congressman Brad Sherman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 12 years ago, quite a number of members of this subcommittee and the full committee joined me and co-sponsored my bill to make Israel a visa waiver country. I'm pleased to report to this subcommittee that while that bill never became law, today the administration announced the action to make Israel a visa waiver country. There is nothing more important for the U.S.-Israel alliance than to allow travel of Israelis to the United States. And the economic benefits of this will be very substantial, as Startup Nation has a lot of deals to do with American business. But now we focus on the purpose of this hearing, which is considerably less joyous. For decades, the Palestinian Authority has paid cash stipends to terrorists in Israeli prisons and their families, and has paid stipends to the families of terrorists who are killed. The clear purpose of this is to incentivize terrorism. Taylor Force, a 28-year-old West Point graduate, was stabbed and killed by a Palestinian terrorist in 2016. That's why we passed the Taylor Force Act. I'll ask any of our witnesses, how much of the PA budget is consumed by these pay-to-slay payments? The PA faces severe budgetary shortfalls and relies on international assistance to sustain itself. Would they be in a better position to provide services to the Palestinian people if they stop these payments? Yes, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Sherman. The number that we hear coming out of the Israeli system is that it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $350 million per year.
And what is that as a percentage of their overall budget? Do any of the witnesses know?
I'm not sure what the current budget is.
The current budget is, of course, not public and not transparent, but the best estimates are that it is somewhere between $4.5 billion and $5 billion annually.
4.5. So closing in on 10% of their budget is going to these terrorist-promoting efforts. And not only do you have to look at the money they lose by making the payments, it's the money that they would be getting from good people around the world if they suspended these payments. Our law in particular, the Taylor-Swift Act, prevents us from direct benefits to the Palestinian Authority. And while we've cut that assistance, pursuant to the Taylor Force Act, we continue to provide indirect assistance, security assistance, and funding through UNRWA. How does this funding impact the effectiveness of the Taylor Force Act? Do we have to do more to affect Palestinian Authority policy, Mr. Abrams?
Any funding that goes around the Taylor Force Act undermines it, and that is true to some extent of UNRWA. UNRWA has its own problems, as you know, Mr. Sherman. In addition, there are the questions of who's on the staff. There are the questions of what's being taught in UNRWA schools. So to use UNRWA as a kind of bypass is really a very bad solution.
I understand. I hope our purpose is to prevent pay to slay, and you give to UNRWA that, for example, in their education programs, promotes terrorism. Dr. Koplow, why is the pay to slay program so politically important for the Palestinian Authority? what consequences do its leaders face themselves if they abandon the program?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The issue of prisoners is paramount in Palestinian society, and so there is an enormous amount of political pressure on Palestinian leadership to make these payments.
Is this the people speaking to the leadership, or is the leadership whipped up this sentiment by propaganda so that they're now responding to the very attitudes that they created?
I'm not sure if I can answer that question, because I think it's something of a chicken and an egg question. But certainly, Palestinian leadership has been grossly irresponsible with this policy. I do think that they are in some ways responsive to sentiments within Palestinian society about the importance of prisoners. And as Mr. Abrams and
I'm going to sneak in. Is there any effort to tell the Palestinian people how much they're losing, not only from the 8 or 9% of their budget, but from the other money that would be flowing were it not for these payments?
I think there is. I think that ordinary Palestinians certainly feel the pinch that the Palestinian Authority is feeling because of its budgetary crisis.
I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Sherman. We now proceed to Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are any of y'all familiar with the Phoenix Center for Research and Field Studies?
Congressman, I'm a bit familiar with it just from its online presence and from some reporting on it I've seen. I have
Simple yes or no will be fine, sir. I'd be fine.
Yes.
Sir? No?
I'm not.
No, Congressman.
Well, the Washington Examiner has brought to light a report by the watchdog group NGO Monitor. The report shows that the Phoenix Center has received over $30,000 in U.S. funds, has been partnered with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Palestine Islamic Jihad, two U.S. designated terror groups. Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to submit this report titled New State Department Grantee Supports Resistance, Partners with Palestinian Islamic Jihad Leaders into the record.
Shall be accepted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, according to the Phoenix Center's website, it has supported armed resistance against Israel, which is, of course, a euphemism for terrorism. I don't know if y'all catch this or not, but we're using American tax dollars to fund these thugs against an ally, Israel, and yet you all, our own State Department, has listed them as a terrorist organization, yet we're funding them. In one discussion, participants in a Phoenix Center meeting emphasized the importance of resistance action and that the viable Palestinian choice of confronting the occupation's threats will require continued resistance action until achieving a third intifada. I'll have to ask somebody else to pronounce that word for me, but y'all know what I'm talking about. But knowing this, do y'all believe that the State Department is conducting appropriate oversight who receives U.S. taxpayer dollars?
Sir, I don't, and I think you're pointing to a big error that State Department and AID make. What they do to vet a group is they ask the National Counterterrorism Center or the FBI, the Phoenix organization, is it on the list? And if it isn't on the list, then everything's fine. They don't do even internet research to try to find out the things that the Washington Examiner had that NGO Monitor found out. They didn't put a spy in the organization.
Well, sir, let me submit to you, we give y'all, what is over $60 billion a year, this State Department. You know, and I'm sure everybody up here will write a strong letter to these terrorists, but they're dirtbags. They're killing people, killing innocent people. That's why we're here today talking about this. I submit to you that that's not acceptable. And I think we as a Congress ought to start acting like a Congress like we're supposed to do and have control over this country's checkbook. And this money, whether it be $30,000 or 30 cents, going to a terrorist group, to me is just not acceptable. What do y'all think needs to happen so that U.S. tax dollars don't up in the hands of designated terror groups?
I think the first thing, sir, is State Department and AID need to go beyond a cursory check. Are they on the list? And start doing some elementary research about recipients. For example, what's on Twitter? For example, what happens if you do an internet search? Because you find out what NGO Monitor found out about this Phoenix group, and that apparently the State Department never found out.
Sir, I would just like to add this, that we have a vetting system that I think does a fairly good job of making sure that funds don't flow to organizations that work with Hamas or Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah. These are the sort of the big three, if you will, in this space. What I've seen consistently over the last several years is that the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, the organization that you just mentioned, often goes overlooked. Now, this is traditionally a Marxist-Leninist organization that in recent years has started...
Are you talking about the State Department or this group?
It's a funny question. I'm talking about the PFLP, sir.
I'm not laughing.
PFLP, sir. The PFLP now receives money directly from Iran, and they have normalized themselves here in the United States. There are a lot of groups, in fact, 6 charities that have been designated by the Israelis. There's been a big flap here in the U.S. about whether the Israeli evidence that they provided against 6 different charities that work with the PFLP, whether their information is correct. I think starting with an investigation into PFLP and some of the other smaller groups might help kind of tighten the noose a little bit on the way that this funding flows.
Let me stop you right there because we're out of time, Mr. Chairman. I would just submit to you that y'all had one job and you failed. I would hope better in the future because we'll be looking at available dollars, and this to me is dollars that need to go elsewhere and not terrorizing Israelis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Congressman Burchett. We now proceed to Congressman Rich McCormick of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the witnesses for your testimony today. U.S. foreign aid money should serve American national interests and should not reward behavior that hurts ourselves or any other country. I think we all agree on that. The Taylor Force Act, signed into law by President Trump in 2018, prohibits U.S. aid money to Palestinian Authority until they stop paying for these stipends for the Martyrs Funds. In 2019, the U.S. made no contributions to the Palestinian Authority because of this, but President Biden blindly resumed these payments with very little evidence of added oversight. I hope anyone who, by the way, cares about Israel or cares about terrorism is paying attention to who they support. This past May, terrorists in Gaza launched rockets at Israel. And since the beginning of the year, Palestinian terrorists have murdered 27 Israeli civilians and 3 soldiers. Our aid cannot continue to reward and encourage this kind of behavior directly or indirectly by honoring those who participate in these activities. Honorable Mr. Abrams, do the Economic Support Fund dollars allocated to the West Bank and Gaza Strip by Biden administration, does it illegally benefit the Palestinian Authority?
Not to my knowledge. I think the ESF funds are being withheld in accordance with the Taylor Force Act.
Does sending aid money to Palestinian Authority serve to direct, does it serve a direct U.S. interest?
I think it's a direct U.S. interest right now that the PA not collapse overnight, because I think that would create chaos.
Have prior reductions in U.S. aid to Palestinian Authority, such as when we denied them their funds, such as Trump did in 2018, did that result in a collapse of the Palestinian Authority?
No, it clearly did not.
Okay, so is it because something's changed since then?
Well, I think it's partly because they keep running up debts. It's partly because they are getting money from other sources. And one of those sources, you know, is the government of Israel, which withholds customs taxes and then pays some of them basically to keep the PA afloat.
Kind of doing a history research on this and looking at the rise and fall of the PLO, the PA, Yasser Arafat. You probably know better than I, but you guys realize Yasser Arafat kind of what brought in this nationalist movement, the anti-Zionist movement, during a time, as far as my research shows, where we had fairly peaceful people that were your typical electricians, your plumbers, your middle-class workers in the Palestinian region. It had free travel all over Israel. And then this nationalist movement. Does anybody want to tell me where Yasser Arafat was born and grew up?
He was born in Egypt, to the best of my knowledge.
Exactly, Egypt. Then he came over to Palestine, raised this nationalist movement, which now we're kind of basically supporting the same nationalist movement, I would make the case, with our tax dollars, which all support martyrs, with our tax dollars for this movement that wasn't even born and started inside of Palestine, but came from a foreign nation with a people that were anti-Zionistic by definition, and now we're paying to support an organization that you said, by the way, didn't suffer when we didn't pay for it. And so I just make the case that we have to be very careful when we decide where our money goes and what we reward, what behaviors we reward. I think we all agreed that this money has been mismanaged, and that if we continue to use money to reward people who do things that are unacceptable to our nation and to foreign nations that we support, we're the ones that hold accountability.
Congressman, it's interesting. People are talking a lot now about the 50th anniversary of the 1973 war. It's also the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. And what you're saying really raises that very interesting question of whether, historically, whether bringing Arafat and his 30,000 troops back, because he was in exile, was a great historic error on the part of Israel.
I would make the case that it is, and they probably made other errors, but I can only be, just like I tell my sons all the time, I'm only accountable for my own actions. And whether Israel makes mistakes or not is on them, but whether we make mistakes with our money and who we support, that's on us. And that's why I call for higher accountability and not to spend money on people who support terrorist organizations. With that, I yield.
Thank you very much, Congressman Rich McCormick. We now proceed to Congressman Michael Lawler of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. 5 years ago, Congress passed the Taylor Force Act, which barred U.S. economic assistance to the Palestinian Authority until it stops all payments incentivizing terror. The PA's Martyr Fund, which is still around today, pays monthly stipends to the families of Palestinians killed, injured, or imprisoned for carrying out attacks against Israel. This pay-to-slay policy covers all terror attacks against Israel, including those that kill Americans. That's why the Taylor Force Act was so important. It was supposed to ensure taxpayer dollars weren't funding the killing of our own children. Unfortunately, the Biden administration resumed these payments despite the Taylor Force Act still very much being the law of the land, and at a time when these killings are still going on. Just this past February, American citizen Ilan Ganels was murdered by a Palestinian terrorist in the West Bank. I'd like to enter into the record a statement by Ilan's mom by unanimous consent.
Absolutely. Unanimous consent.
She's going through just about the worst thing that could happen to a parent. And I'd also like to welcome Ilan's brother, Simon, who traveled to D.C. today to witness this important hearing. We must honor Ilan's memory instead of fueling the hate that led to his death. Mr. Abrams, as you mentioned in your testimony, the Taylor Force Act requires the U.S. ambassador to the UN and the U.S. Secretary of State to highlight this issue on the international stage and pressure the PA to stop these payments. Mr. Abrams, to the best of your knowledge, can you think of one single time Linda Thompson Greenfield or Antony Blinken brought up this among our allies and pressed the PA to stop pay-to-slay?
Not to my knowledge, Mr. Lawler, and there is a thing called the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee, which is the international group that tries to get funding for the Palestinians, and I don't think the United States made this a big issue there either.
Not only have they not made it a big issue, they've failed completely to comply with this requirement, but they've actually been encouraging other countries to raise payments to the PA. It's absurd. And it's encouraging terrorism, violence, and corruption, and it violates our laws. And I've been especially appalled at the administration's dragging their disregard for the Taylor Force Act into negotiations regarding a Saudi Arabia-Israel normalization agreement. I've consistently said that bringing Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords is critical to cement Israel's role in the Middle East, but the Biden administration is going about it all wrong. Recent reports indicate that a potential deal may include Saudi Arabia resuming financial payments to the PA. And this is just another example of the Biden administration neglecting the Taylor Force Act and instead choosing to bolster the credibility of the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and pro-terror PA. Mr. Abrams, are you aware of these reports? And can you give a few thoughts on how this agreement could be dangerous?
If the agreement basically undermines the Taylor Force Act by getting the Saudis or others to give cash to the PA, then it really is undermining the legislation completely. And it's rewarding the PA for refusing to comply with what the Taylor Force Act demands. So as the Abraham Accords grow in importance, and maybe there's an agreement that includes Saudi Arabia, this issue becomes far more important because it would potentially allow the PA to laugh off the Taylor Force Act.
I'd like to submit an op-ed recently written by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Sandra Gerber by unanimous consent.
Unanimous consent granted.
Mr. Abrams, did you read this recent op-ed by Secretary Pompeo and Sandra Gerber?
I did.
In sum and substance, they call for Saudi Arabia and the United States to create a responsible mechanism to help the Palestinian people without furthering PA corruption and support for terrorism. Specifically, they call for the establishment of a Saudi-led international aid organization independent of the Palestinian Authority or the United Nations. Do you support this idea?
I do. I think it's a terrific idea.
To our other witnesses, do you support this idea?
I would support it, yes.
Congressman, I think that's one approach. I think another potential approach is using the opportunity of the leverage that Saudi Arabia has over the Palestinian Authority to actually force it to implement some of the reforms that we've discussed here today.
Look, there's no question that Saudi Arabia has the ability to have influence, and I think that's why the Abraham Accords is so important. It's why I advocated for a special envoy for the Abraham Accords so that we can focus on getting Saudi Arabia to the table. But I think one thing is fundamentally clear. The PA is a corrupt authority, and no one, including the United States nor our allies, should be in any way funding them. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Lawler. And I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony. I want to thank the members who are here today. I'm also very, very appreciative of the Foreign Affairs staff that are so dedicated. And at this time, we may have additional questions from for the witnesses. And then I would like to invite our Congress members who are still here for a picture with the our witnesses. If the witnesses would stay in place, and Rich and Michael, y'all are welcome to come and have a picture taken. And I want to also invite Simon Gunnels to be in the picture. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.